The blue lunchbox hit the marble floor as silver covers were lifted from 12 plates. Its dented lid sprang open. Nothing was inside except a folded paper napkin. Nora had been hired only 4 days earlier, after 3 celebrated chefs quit because Walter would not eat. That afternoon she had prepared his late wife's rosemary chicken for a family meeting about the company's future. Caroline had warned her that the meal needed to be flawless. Mason had entered while talking on his phone, clipped the service cart with one careless hand, and sent the lunchbox spinning. The wealthy relatives watched it cross the white stone as if a private little shame had rolled out with it. Nora recognized that look. She had seen it whenever poverty became visible in a beautiful room. The Ashford dining room went silent. Then Mason Ashford laughed. "That is impressive," he said. "A cook who forgot to cook her own lunch." 2 cousins smiled into their glasses. At the far end of the table, Caroline Ashford looked from the empty box to Nora Reed's worn shoes. "Perhaps it was meant to be noticed," Caroline said. "Some people are very skilled at turning need into a performance." Nora crouched and picked up the lunchbox. She was 50, with tired hands, steady gray eyes, and a white kitchen jacket that had been mended twice at one cuff. A pink flush climbed her neck, but her voice remained calm. "I'm sorry it interrupted lunch." She closed the lid and placed the box beneath her service cart. She did not explain that it had held 1 turkey sandwich, an apple, and 2 oatmeal cookies that morning. She did not tell them about finding 9-year-old Sophie Ashford crying behind the greenhouse, too frightened to enter the dining room after spilling juice on her new dress. "Dad said I ruin every important day," Sophie had whispered. Nora had sat beside her on the cold stone step. She had cut the sandwich in half, then quietly given Sophie both pieces when the girl finished the first. The apple and cookies followed. By the time Sophie stopped trembling, the blue lunchbox was empty. Now 12 people had food in front of them, yet Nora was the only one being judged for having none. At the head of the table, 82-year-old Walter Ashford stared at his plate. Since his stroke and the death of his wife, Evelyn, food had become something he moved around with a fork. The family hired nutritionists, chefs, and private nurses. Nothing made him eat. Nora turned toward the kitchen. "Stop." Walter's voice was rough from disuse. Everyone looked at him. He pushed his plate away. "Bring another chair." Caroline stiffened. "Walter, Nora is working. Then she can stop." He pointed to the empty place beside him. "Set it there. Staff do not eat at the family table." Walter looked at the relatives who had laughed, then at Nora's hidden lunchbox. "If the woman who fed this house has no place here, this family can go hungry. If Nora doesn't eat, neither do I." No one smiled now. Nora met his eyes. "I don't need charity, Mr. Ashford." "Neither did I," Walter said softly. "But once somebody fed me anyway." That answer changed something. Nora allowed a chair to be brought, but she remained standing until Walter introduced her as his guest. Only then did she sit. Walter divided his rosemary chicken and potatoes in half. He placed one portion on her plate and kept the other. "We share," he said. "No debts." Nora took one bite. Walter watched her, then lifted his own fork. Around them, the family sat in stunned silence as he ate his first real mouthful in weeks. When lunch ended, Nora reached beneath the cart. Walter put one hand over the blue lunchbox before she could lift it. Inside the lid, beneath years of scratches, a sentence had been written in faded black ink. "There is always room for one more." Walter's fingers began to shake. Under the sentence was one name. Evelyn. He looked up at Nora, grief and suspicion fighting in his face. "Where did you get something that belonged to my wife?" Nora could have answered Walter in front of everyone. Instead, she picked up the lunchbox and asked if they could speak in the kitchen. Caroline started to object, but Walter was already standing. In the quiet pantry, Nora placed the box between them. "I met Evelyn 7 years ago at Harbor Street Community Kitchen." Walter frowned. "Evelyn never mentioned Harbor Street. Maybe she thought you knew." Nora explained that her husband, Paul, had been dying from kidney disease. Medical bills had swallowed their savings, then their home. Nora worked mornings in a school cafeteria and evenings in a diner, but some weeks there was still nothing left after medicine. The first time she entered Harbor Street, shame kept her near the door. Evelyn did not ask for documents or explanations. She handed Nora an apron and said, "You can help me slice bread while your supper cooks." It allowed Nora to receive a meal without feeling reduced to a hungry woman in a line. She remembered what dignity felt like, Nora said. That mattered as much as the food. After Paul died, Nora returned to volunteer. Evelyn taught her how to stretch broth, rescue burned gravy, and notice the person pretending not to be hungry. Shortly before Evelyn became ill, she gave Nora the blue lunchbox and a bundle of recipe cards. Walter opened the lid again. His thumb followed Evelyn's faded words. "She carried my lunch in this when we had our first diner," he said. Nora heard the loneliness beneath the sentence. Then she carried it a long way. The next morning, Walter sent away the elaborate breakfast Caroline had ordered. He asked Nora for Evelyn's chicken and rice soup. "I can cook her recipe," Nora said, "but I can't bring her back." His expression hardened. "I know that. Do you? Because I won't use her memory to trick you into eating. I'll make it if you want to live long enough to taste something new tomorrow." No employee spoke to Walter Ashford that way. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he nodded. "Something new tomorrow." Nora cooked the soup. Walter finished one bowl and asked for half of another. When Sophie slipped into the breakfast room, she placed a crayon drawing beside him. 3 figures sat around a crooked table: Sophie, Walter, and Nora. Above them she had written, "Grandpa ate today." Walter touched the drawing as carefully as if it were glass. "Thank you, Nora," he said. It was the first time he used her name without an order attached. Later, Walter asked why the lunchbox had been empty. Nora told him about Sophie, but she asked him not to scold anyone or turn the sandwich into a family drama. She needed one safe hour, Nora said. Walter found Sophie in the library and did not question her. He simply sat on the carpet while she colored. Before Nora left that night, she discovered half a cheese sandwich wrapped in a linen napkin inside the blue box. A note beside it read, "Something new tomorrow." She ate it on the bus home. Over the following days, he began appearing in the kitchen while Nora worked. She told him which herbs he was crushing incorrectly. He told her stories about washing dishes at 16. Respect grew in small, unannounced moments. On Thursday, Walter noticed Nora packing serving spoons into a cardboard carton. "Where are those going?" "Harbor Street. We're holding our final supper Sunday." The warmth left his face. "Final?" "The building was sold. We have 10 days to leave." "That building cannot be sold." Caroline stood in the doorway. She had heard him. "It can," she said. "Ashford Hotels owns it, and the board approved the transaction while you were recovering." Walter gripped the back of a chair. "Evelyn intended it to feed people. Intentions do not satisfy lenders. The deposit kept 6 hotels open last month." Nora looked from Caroline to Walter. His shock seemed real, but Caroline's next words made doubt enter the room. "The buyer signs in 10 days, she said. "And before you accuse me of stealing Evelyn's legacy, you should ask why Harbor Street was available as collateral in the first place." Caroline came to Nora's room above the garage before sunrise. She carried an envelope and did not sit. "6 months' pay," she said. "More than your contract requires." Nora left the envelope untouched. "What does it require from me?" "Professional boundaries. You stopped discussing Harbor Street with Walter. You finished this week and we give you an excellent reference." Caroline's voice was controlled, but exhaustion showed beneath her makeup. She explained that Ashford Hotels had never fully recovered from the recession and the travel shutdown. A lender could call its debt within weeks. Hundreds of workers had pensions tied to the company. "That sale is not buying me a yacht," Caroline said. "It is keeping housekeepers and desk clerks employed." Nora understood fear. She had watched unpaid bills gather beside her husband's medicine. But understanding did not require surrender. "If silence is part of the payment," she said, "then it isn't severance. It's a purchase." Caroline took the envelope and left. Nora did not run to Walter. Instead, she spent the day calling former volunteers, borrowing folding chairs, and planning Harbor Street's final supper. If the doors had to close, the people who built the place would close them together. Walter insisted on attending. "You may come," Nora told him, "but not with reporters, lawyers, or a giant check." "What am I allowed to bring?" "An appetite." Sunday evening, Walter entered Harbor Street through a faded red door. The room smelled of onions, yeast, and lemon cleaner. No crystal chandelier hung overhead. Every chair was different. Still, he stopped as if he had entered a cathedral. Nora moved through the crowded kitchen with confident speed. She repaired a freezer seal with a folded towel, showed a nervous trainee how to thicken stew, and slipped 2 wrapped meals into the bag of a mother who claimed she had already eaten. Walter noticed absolutely everything. When a volunteer handed him an apron, he tied it without complaint. Nora placed him beside the bread baskets. "1 roll each until everyone is served. I built 40 hotels. Tonight you're guarding rolls." For the first time in months he laughed. Ben quietly thanked Harbor Street for feeding his children during a strike. A retired teacher showed Nora the catering certificate she had earned in Evelyn's first training class. Nobody asked Walter for a photograph or investment. They asked him to pass bowls, refill water, and move his chair so an elderly guest could reach the aisle. Each ordinary request loosened the stiffness in his shoulders. When a little boy dropped a roll, Walter automatically reached for another. Nora caught his eye and nodded. He had remembered her rule before she needed to speak. Across the room, Mason watched Sophie help clear plates. She was usually silent at formal dinners, afraid of using the wrong fork. Here she laughed when soap bubbles covered her sleeves. Mason began to understand that the building offered something their estate could not purchase: permission to be useful without being impressive. Still, fear of defying Caroline held him back. Mason arrived with Sophie, intending to collect Walter before the meal. He looked at the cracked tiles and crowded tables. "We're risking the company for this?" he asked. "Nostalgia is expensive." Sophie pulled away from him. On the rear wall she had found dozens of photographs. Evelyn appeared in many of them, wearing an apron and serving beside a younger Nora. "She doesn't look expensive," Sophie said. "She looks happy." Mason had no answer. After supper, Nora unlocked a small office. From the bottom drawer of an old metal desk, she removed a cream envelope. "Evelyn gave this to me during her last week here," she told Walter. "She said to give it to you if your family ever tried to close Harbor Street." "Why didn't you send it?" "Because people with money are always being approached by people who need it. I didn't want you to think that was all this place meant." Walter stared at his name in Evelyn's handwriting. "And now? Now the doors are closing whether you trust me or not." He broke the seal. Inside was a letter and a small brass key. Walter read silently until his breath caught. Nora saw the powerful man disappear, leaving an old widower holding the final words of the woman he loved. Mason stepped closer. "What does it say?" Walter read the first sentence aloud. "If Harbor Street is ever in danger, tell our family where its fortune truly began." The brass key opened a narrow cabinet behind Harbor Street's pantry door. Inside lay an old account book, a red scarf, and a photograph curled at the corners. Walter lifted the photograph with both hands. He was 17 in the picture, though Mason barely recognized him. His cheeks were hollow, his coat was too large, and a bowl of soup sat between his hands. Beside him stood a young Evelyn, wearing the same red scarf. "My father drank," Walter said. "When he died, he left debts and an eviction notice. I slept in a bus station for 11 nights. The room grew still. Walter had entered Harbor Street because he smelled bread through an open window. Pride made him refuse a free meal, so Evelyn asked him to help stack chairs. When he finished, she divided her own soup into 2 bowls. "She knew I could accept half of hers," Walter said, "even when I couldn't accept one of my own." The cooks found him work washing dishes. Later they lent him a cart and dented pans so he could sell breakfast near the train station. Evelyn sold a small diamond ring to cover the first month's rent on the diner that eventually became Ashford Hotels. "Every dollar carrying our name began because hungry people shared food with someone hungrier," Walter said. Mason looked again at the cracked walls. For the first time he did not see a failing property. He saw the first room in his family's history. Nora watched Walter return the photograph to its cabinet. "Why did you leave?" she asked. "I told myself I was building something worthy of what they gave me." "And when did building become forgetting?" Walter flinched, but he did not turn away. One successful year at a time. The following afternoon he called an emergency meeting in the Ashford dining room. Nora attended at his request. This time she entered without a serving tray. Walter placed Evelyn's photograph beside the blue lunchbox. He told the board and family everything: the bus station, the shared soup, the borrowed cart, and the ring. Caroline listened with her hands folded. When he finished, Sophie asked, "If that place fed Grandpa, why are we taking food away from it?" Caroline's face tightened. "Because a company is responsible for living employees, not only beautiful memories." She spoke about employees who had called her personally when the company nearly missed payroll. One housekeeper had asked whether her health insurance would survive the winter. Caroline had promised it would even before she knew how. Her husband, David, had once handled those promises. After his death, every frightened voice came to her. "I did not wake up wanting to sell this place," she said. "I woke up with a bank deadline and more families depending on me than there are chairs in this room." Walter's expression softened, but he did not retreat. Fear can explain a decision. It cannot make the decision honest. For the first time, Caroline saw that Walter was not chasing Evelyn's ghost. He was facing the dead her memory exposed. Caroline glanced at Nora. "And memory can explain your sudden concern. It cannot make you chairman again." "People still eat there," Sophie said. "And people still work at our hotels." Caroline turned toward Walter. "Canceling this sale could cost hundreds of families their income." Walter announced that the transaction would be suspended until every alternative had been examined. Caroline rose. "You no longer have that authority." She placed a folder on the table. During Walter's recovery, he had signed a temporary medical leave agreement. It transferred executive decisions to Caroline and required independent clearance before his return. "I am not incompetent," Walter said. "No. You are grieving, angry, and making financial decisions because a new employee brought you an old letter." Nora stood. "I never asked him for money." "You gave him a ghost." Caroline's voice finally cracked. "Do you know what happened after Evelyn died?" "He stopped signing payroll. He stopped answering the bank. I held this company together while the rest of you mourned." Her pain was real. So was the cruelty that followed. "Nora, your employment ends today." Walter struck the table with his palm. "You will not fire her. Under the agreement you signed, I just did." A security officer appeared in the doorway, visibly ashamed. Nora picked up the lunchbox before he could approach her. "I can walk out by myself," she said. Walter reached for her. "Nora, wait." She paused beside him. "Find out what is true. Then decide what you are willing to lose for it." As Nora crossed the hall, Caroline followed. "You think I stole Evelyn's legacy," she said quietly. "Ask Walter why a bank has his signature on Harbor Street." "I did not put it there." Nora returned to Harbor Street with no job and 3 days left on the lease. She placed the blue lunchbox on the kitchen counter, tied on an apron, and began chopping carrots. Work was the only answer she trusted while anger was speaking. By noon, Caroline arrived with a lawyer. This time, the envelope she carried could have paid Nora's remaining medical debt and rented another kitchen for a year. "No one has to lose," Caroline said. "Move the meal program across town. Sign a confidentiality agreement, and I will make sure the transition is funded." Nora read the first page. She would have to surrender Evelyn's letter, promise never to criticize the Ashfords, and acknowledge that Harbor Street held no special obligation to the community. "You're not saving the kitchen," Nora said. "You're buying a quieter funeral. I am offering you security." For a moment, Nora imagined accepting. She could clear the bills still arriving in Paul's name. The volunteers could keep serving meals. She would no longer wake at night calculating how many weeks remained before she lost her apartment. Then she saw Evelyn's handwriting inside the lunchbox. "Security that requires silence belongs to the person paying for it," Nora said. "Not the person receiving it." She returned the pen. That evening Walter came alone. He looked smaller without his driver, tailored coat and title. He placed a personal check on the counter. It is enough to stop the sale while I challenge the board. Nora tore the unsigned check in half. Walter stared at her. Why? Because Caroline will say I found a grieving man and pulled money from him. And some part of you will wonder the same thing when this gets hard. I know who you are. Then stand beside me with the truth, not in front of me with a check. Walter lowered himself into a chair. I don't know what truth she meant. Mason found it the next morning in a basement records room at Ashford headquarters. Sophie's question had followed him there. Are adults allowed to hide the truth because they are scared? The original mortgage carried Walter's signature. 17 years earlier, Ashford hotels had expanded too quickly before a recession. To prevent bankruptcy, Walter pledged Harbor Street and several other properties as collateral. Evelyn objected. Walter promised the loan would be cleared within 5 years. It never was. Caroline had accelerated the current sale, concealed another valuation and tied part of her compensation to closing the deal. But she had not created the debt. Walter had. Mason brought the documents to Harbor Street during its final public supper. Walter read the first page and closed his eyes. Memory returned before explanation did. I signed it, he said. Nora waited. The company was failing. Thousands of people depended on us. I thought I could protect both places. Did Evelyn know? Yes. Did you restore the building when the company recovered? Walter looked down. Nora's anger became quieter and more dangerous. When did later become never? I kept believing the next quarter would give me more room. There was always another quarter for you. Harbor Street only had the promise. Walter reached toward her, but Nora stepped back. He had defended her at the dining table. He had revealed his past in front of his family. Yet all that courage had arrived after years of easier silence. You let me believe Caroline was destroying something you protected, Nora said. She is responsible for what she did. But you handed her the match. After the guests left, Mason suggested releasing Evelyn's letter and the mortgage records to the press. Public anger could frighten the buyer away. Nora held the letter. One call might save the building. It would also turn Evelyn's love into a weapon and Walter's worst failure into entertainment. Outside, volunteers taped final supper notices to the windows. Nora watched one woman trace Evelyn's name on the paper before walking away. Refusing the press meant she might disappoint every person who trusted her. Calling meant winning through the same humiliation she had condemned. For once, the easier choice and the crueler choice were the same. The kitchen was worth more than paperwork. No, she said. If we save a place built on dignity by stripping everyone of theirs, we have already closed it. Walter left without asking for forgiveness. Near midnight, Nora sat alone beneath the dark serving window. The brave answer she had given Mason no longer felt brave. It felt expensive. She opened the empty lunchbox and finally cried. The rear door creaked. Sophie entered carrying a sandwich wrapped in too much foil. Mason stood several steps behind her. I made it, Sophie said. It has both kinds of mustard because I didn't know which one you like. She placed it in the box. It shouldn't stay empty just because people were mean. Nora pulled her into a hug. Mason set the mortgage papers on the table. My mother hid the sale. My grandfather made it possible. If we save this place, the truth has to save it with us. At 9 the next morning, Walter returned to Harbor Street. No lawyer came with him. No press waited outside. He asked Nora for 5 minutes before the volunteers began packing. She gave him 3. Walter stood beneath Evelyn's photograph and told everyone what he had done. He described the expansion, the mortgage, and every year he failed to restore the property. He did not blame his stroke, Caroline, or grief. I used this building to protect my company, he said. Then I let success convince me the broken promise no longer mattered. It mattered most to the people who had the least power to enforce it. An elderly volunteer named June asked, Are you here to give it back? I'm here to ask how. All eyes turned to Nora. She still felt betrayed, but Walter had finally brought the truth to the room where the damage lived. A rescue check won't do it, she said. If Harbor Street depends on one rich family feeling generous, another frightened executive can close it later. Nora unrolled several pages across a table. 4 months, she had been planning a training program that would teach unemployed adults commercial cooking. Harbor Street could earn reliable income by preparing meals for 2 schools, a senior center, and a small hospital. Free community suppers would continue 3 nights a week. She had projected food costs, wages, repairs, and enrollment. Former trainees had agreed to teach. Local farmers would sell surplus produce at reduced prices. The city had a workforce grant available if Harbor Street secured matching funds and a long lease. Mason studied the numbers. This could actually support itself. Not immediately, Nora said. But it can become more than a room people beg not to lose. Nora also created a hardship rule. No trainee would be dismissed for missing class because of childcare, transportation, or an unstable home. The program would solve the problem first, just as Evelyn once gave Nora an apron instead of demanding proof that she deserved dinner. Walter read every page. You were preparing this before the sale? I was preparing it because charity without a future exhausts the people doing it. He looked ashamed. I thought leadership meant arriving with the largest answer. Sometimes it means asking who has been working on the answer while you were gone. Walter pulled out a chair for Nora. It was not forgiveness, but it was the first quiet step back toward trust. Walter offered to sell his country house and contribute the proceeds as the matching endowment. He would also use part of the money to protect the employee pension fund Caroline feared losing. Not a donation, Nora said. Restitution. Walter nodded quietly. Put that word in the agreement. Mason reviewed the transaction files. Caroline had rejected a slower offer that would have allowed the kitchen to remain as a tenant. The faster sale protected the lender deadline, but it also triggered a large executive bonus. She had disclosed neither fact to the full board. When confronted, Caroline did not deny it. I earned that bonus holding this company together, she said. I buried my husband, managed Walter's collapse, and kept 23 properties open while everyone judged the decisions they were too weak to make. Nora faced her across the kitchen. You carried more than anyone admitted. That explains why you were afraid. It does not give you ownership of everyone else's future. Caroline's certainty slipped, but she would not support the plan. Nora added 3 conditions: an independent financial review, a permanent community charter, and a rule preventing any Ashford from controlling Harbor Street alone. Walter agreed immediately. The emergency board meeting began that afternoon. Walter voted for Nora's proposal. Caroline voted for the existing sale. 2 outside directors split their votes. Everything came down to Mason. He arrived late carrying the battered blue lunchbox. Sophie followed with Evelyn's photograph pressed against her chest. Mason placed the box beside his blank ballot. Caroline asked to speak with him privately, but Mason refused. For years, family decisions had been made behind closed doors and presented as unavoidable facts. If his vote was going to wound his mother, he wanted the reasons heard in the same room. Walter did not try to influence him. Nora noticed how difficult that restraint was for a man who had once controlled every decision with his signature. The buyer's representative warned that canceling would bring penalties. Nora answered with a revised appraisal, signed catering commitments, and the schedule for Walter's asset sale. For every threat she had prepared a number. For every number she could name the people it affected. The board could no longer dismiss her as a cook carrying an emotional story. Before I vote, he said, Nora needs to tell this board why it was empty. Nora stood before people accustomed to presentations filled with polished words and rising numbers. She had no slides. She opened the blue lunchbox. The day your family laughed at this box, it had been full that morning, she said. I gave my lunch to Sophie because she was hungry and afraid. Mason looked at his daughter. Shame lowered his eyes. You saw emptiness and assumed I had failed to provide for myself. But the box was empty because something inside it had been shared. Nora placed Evelyn's photograph beside it. That is also how your fortune began. She did not ask the board to preserve a museum. She presented the training contracts, the city grant, and Walter's restitution. She asked them to protect a working kitchen that could feed people without begging for an annual miracle. Caroline turned to Mason. If this fails, employees will suffer. You know what I have done to protect them. I do, he said. You kept the company alive after Dad died. You also hid choices from us because you stopped believing anyone else could be trusted. His voice shook, but it did not break. I love you, Mom. I'm still voting for Harbor Street. He marked the ballot. Outside the boardroom, the Harbor Street volunteers waited with boxes. When June received Nora's message, she did not cheer at first. She read it twice, covered her mouth, and handed the phone to Ben. Then the hallway filled with laughter. One trainee pulled the final supper notice from the window and turned it over. On the blank side, Sophie wrote "First day coming soon" in purple marker. Nora watched people tape it back to the glass. The building had not been saved by one signature. It had been claimed by everyone willing to stay. For several seconds, Caroline stared at the mark. Then she closed the folder in front of her. She did not congratulate Nora or pretend the loss did not hurt. She only asked whether the pension protection was legally guaranteed. Nora slid the relevant agreement across the table. Caroline read it twice before giving a small nod. Walter then admitted that removing Caroline alone would create a comforting lie. The board had rewarded his expansion for years and ignored the debt tied to Harbor Street. He requested that the independent review include his decisions and compensation as well. Two directors shifted uneasily. Accountability had moved beyond the easiest target. Mason apologized to Nora for laughing. She accepted the apology but did not rescue him from the shame behind it. Let that feeling teach you what Sophie saw before you did, she said. Sophie squeezed his hand. The sale was cancelled. Caroline was removed from authority over the transaction. Her bonus was forfeited, and the board ordered an independent review. Walter resigned as chairman and signed the country house sale documents. Harbor Street received a permanent community charter that no member of the Ashford family could undo. Then the outside directors appointed Nora executive director of the new program. Not because Walter wants it, June told her. Because you already built it. That evening, volunteers covered the boardroom table with mismatched bowls from Harbor Street. Walter sat before a serving of Nora's soup but did not lift his spoon. Mason gave him a worried look. Grandpa. Walter counted the cooks, trainees, dishwashers, and guests still standing near the wall. We have not set enough places. More chairs were brought. No one ate until every worker had a seat. When Nora finally sat beside Walter, he tasted the soup and smiled. Sophie removed her mustard sandwich from the lunchbox. Nora divided it into 4 uneven pieces for Sophie, Mason, Walter, and herself. Walter raised his piece. No debts. No debts, Nora agreed. But plenty of responsibilities. Laughter moved around the table, warm rather than cruel. Only Caroline remained apart. She stood in the doorway without her folders or authority. Justice had arrived, but healing had not followed automatically. Walter noticed the last empty chair. He did not invite Caroline himself. That choice no longer belonged to him. Nora, he said quietly, is that seat for Caroline, or is some damage too deep for one table? 6 months later, the faded sign above Harbor Street had been replaced. The new one read Evelyn's Table, Community Kitchen and Culinary Training Center. The red door remained. Nora insisted on that. Every weekday morning, 12 trainees learned knife skills, food safety, budgeting, and the quiet art of noticing who needed an extra portion. Their paid contracts supplied lunches to 2 schools, a senior center, and the county hospital. 3 evenings a week, anyone could sit down for supper without proving hunger. Nora ran the program from the same metal desk where Evelyn's letter had waited. Her debts were not magically erased, but she earned a stable salary and no longer carried fear alone. Walter volunteered every Tuesday. At first, people treated him like a visiting donor. Nora solved that by assigning him to wash pants. I founded an international company, he protested. Then this sink should be manageable. He became surprisingly good at it. Mason managed the center's transparent community fund under the supervision of 2 neighborhood trustees. He spent fewer evenings at the office and more with Sophie. She still drew crooked tables, but now every picture had more chairs than people. Caroline did not attend the opening celebration. Nora had left the final chair empty at the boardroom dinner, telling Walter, "A place can be available without pretending trust has already returned." 3 weeks later, Caroline entered through the red door alone. No assistant followed. No photographer waited outside. She found Nora packing meals. "I thought protecting the company meant I was protecting the family," Caroline said. "Eventually, I used both words to excuse anything I wanted." Nora continued sealing containers. "An apology opens a door. It doesn't rebuild the room." "What does?" Nora handed her an apron. "Showing up after nobody is impressed." Caroline began serving on Thursday nights. She moved too quickly, reorganized shelves without asking, and tried to turn every problem into a meeting. Each time Nora corrected her. Slowly, Caroline learned to listen before leading. Some volunteers believed Nora had let her return too soon. Others believed consequences meant little if they offered no path back. Nora understood both. Forgiveness, she decided, was not declaring the harm finished. It was allowing repair to begin while keeping the truth in the room. One Tuesday, Sophie arrived with the blue lunchbox. She had packed 2 sandwiches, 2 apples, and 4 oatmeal cookies. "One lunch is for you," she told Nora. "The other is for whoever pretends they already ate." The first person to receive it was a trainee named Caleb, a father sleeping in his car while saving for an apartment. He always volunteered to clean during meals so no one would notice him skipping them. Nora handed him half a sandwich and asked him to help test the mustard. He understood the invitation and sat down without shame. Across the kitchen, Walter saw the exchange. Years earlier, Evelyn had divided her soup the same way. He pressed a hand against the note in his pocket, then returned to the sink before grief could turn the moment into something about him. Beneath the sandwiches, Nora found a note in Walter's uneven handwriting.